Hello, thank you all for tuning in. My name is William Lewis, and you are in store for a fascinating discussion today. And not just because I'm moderating, but because we have a great lineup of panelists to talk about the disruptive forces driving the global economy today. With a looming US recession, high inflation, and fundamental changes to the way we work, business leaders are more than ever having to manage increasingly complex priorities to ensure they deliver for their various stakeholders. We'll look at what these forces are and the steps executives need to take in the short and long term to thrive during unprecedented times. Before we jump in, I'd like to introduce our lineup of star panelists. Simon Freakley, CEO of AlixPartners, which provides transformative leadership to businesses and stakeholders, responding to their most complex and critical challenges. Gillian Tett is the chair of the Editorial Board and Editor-at-large US of the Financial Times. She writes must-read weekly columns covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues, and co-founded Moral Money, the FT sustainability newsletter. Gillian is also an author of note and recently published a must-read book called Anthropology, explaining how anthropology can explain business and life. And last but definitely not least, Peter Robinson. Peter just came back from Tel Aviv, where I think he sat down with Netanyahu. So thank you for making the time despite your busy travel schedule, Peter. He is, of course, the Murdoch Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he writes about business and politics, edits Hoover's quarterly journal, the Hoover Digest, and hosts Hoover's video series program, Uncommon Knowledge. Peter was a speechwriter to President Ronald Reagan and wrote the historic Berlin Wall address, in which President Reagan, of course, called on General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. So hello to you all. Thank you so much for joining me for today's discussion, which also coincides with the release of AlixPartners' Disruption Index. Now, Simon, I'm going to throw the first question to you, if I may. As I just said, AlixPartners' Disruption Report has inspired today's discussion. So the first question, given the richness of the report and some of the really fascinating things it throws out, is are we in a really uniquely disruptive time?
Thank you, Will. Well, a few years ago, we realized at AlixPartners from the frontline work that we were doing with our clients around the world that every business in every industry, in every geography was getting increasingly disrupted. So we decided to study it. We did a deep study in 2019, which I actually launched at the World Economic Forum in January 2020. Little knowing, of course, that the mother of all disruptions was about to happen, the pandemic. But what our study back in 19 showed, that indeed there were multiple disruptions happening around the world, and the cycles of disruption were becoming more regular and more profound than economic cycles. And so it was such rich material, we decided, as you know, to do this study every single year. What we're seeing this year is that disruption is alive and well. There's the longer playing disruptions, technological, environmental, societal, demographic. But now, of course, there are these short, sharp disruptions like war in the Ukraine, the supply chain disruptions that continue, notwithstanding the pandemic. So in every geography, Will, we're seeing disruptions compounding on each other. And in the 3,000 executive interviews we've done this year, we are facing an even more disrupted world than normal.
And worth noting, those 3,000 are evenly split in North America, EMEA, and APAC. And Simon, you say you've been doing it, as you correctly, for some time. I was particularly struck by how 80% of CEOs say they are feeling really quite disrupted. Just give us some perspective on that. Does it feel like the most significant set of disruptive incomings to CEOs that you've seen since the report started?
Absolutely, Will. I think more disruption than ever. But not only are business leaders having to deal with these multiple disruptions that are compounding on each other, but they're exhausted. The scope of issues that they have to deal with, so many different disruptions, all of which are urgent, many of which are very important. Knowing which one to focus on first is a real challenge. And so what we're seeing is that the anxiety of business leaders has gone up significantly over the last year as they try and work out how to navigate their businesses through these multiple and profound disruptions.
Yes, and that anxiety, Julie, I want to come to you because you spend a lot of time talking to business leaders, CEOs, and have frequent conversations. Worth noting in the report that 70% of CEOs are worried for their own jobs, which would be logical given the profound nature of the disruptive times that we live in. But Gillian, does this ring bells with you? Is this what you're hearing when you speak to business leaders?
Yeah, I would agree that there's a real mood of anxiety and fear and a sense of destabilization amongst business leaders. And the way I see it is that part of that stems from the specific short-term shocks, which we can readily identify and put on the front page of newspapers like the Financial Times, like inflation, like recession, like swings in oil prices. That's the kind of simple stuff. In addition to that, though, I think there's two longer-term structural shifts happening which help to explain what's going on. The first is the fact that in the few decades before 2008, there was a perception amongst the Western elite, so-called Davos man, that history wasn't so much dead, to cite Francis Fukuyama, but it was going in one direction, in the sense that the three ideas that underpinned the Western liberal order, a belief in democracy, free market capitalism, and globalization, those three factors were presumed to be not just self-evidently good, but spreading and deepening across the world. And so most Western executives thought that the future was one where it basically got more democratic, more globalized, and more free market and capitalist, if you like, going forward indefinitely. And really, starting in 2008, all three of those core pillars of ideas have been, if not shaken, tossed into reverse. The 2008 financial crisis essentially was a beginning of financial globalization being shaken. It was a beginning of more government intervention. Since then, we've had protectionism and populism. We've had heavy government intervention in the money markets via quantitative easing. We had COVID, which created more shocks. And now, of course, we've got a wartime economy and the shock of a real war and globalization unraveling. So that is tossing people into a really unfamiliar world, which frankly is radically different from what most of them grew up with, where they thought that history went in one direction. The second big shock, of course, is technological, and the degree to which the internet is not just changing the way that we communicate with each other, but causing really radical shifts in trust patterns. So we're going from a world where people trusted authority figures and got information from authority figures to a world where people look to their peer group and the wisdom of extended online crowds. Is a pattern that anthropologists call distributed trust that's now gluing societies together or not gluing them together. And that requires a very different pattern of leadership. It creates very uncertain flash mobs of protest. And it also, when you couple with things like AI, leaves many executives wondering whether they have the right skill set to navigate an increasingly digitized world and a younger workforce that's used to using digital tools to customize their life to their own demands and to communicate with each other in a way that's quite alien to older leaders.
That's absolutely fascinating. And actually, that last point, execs being concerned that they and their teams don't have the skill set that's required, particularly for the AI challenge and others, is really comes through. It's fascinating. It's very, very stark. Peter, I want to bring you in San Francisco. Thank you very much for joining us. Not too jet lagged, I hope.
Not too jet lagged. I've slept 16 of the last 24 hours, so I'm all right.
Oh, you are ready for a conversation then. So the first point Gillian made there, Peter, about this crumbling of the Francis Fukuyama end of history order. If I can summarize it rather crassly like that. Would you agree with that, Peter?
I'd agree with that. Yes, that's sort of the long arc of disruption. What's most striking here in the startup ecosystem at the moment is the disappearance of money. We've been through a decade now in which Silicon Valley maybe the only place and the only time in all of human history in which money really wasn't the problem. There was plenty of it. And now all of a sudden, the Fed, with it having raised its balance sheet from in 2007, a little under $1 trillion, to today, just under $9 trillion, the Fed wants to soak some of that back up. And interest rates go up. And this is something new. So I talked to a friend of mine who's a venture investor, and he said they've now divided their entire portfolio of startups into two groups. One, those with enough cash on hand to get through the next 24 months. Two, those that are in trouble. This is an entirely new for the entrepreneurs who are running startups. They've not experienced this. One. Two, for the kids. I work at the Hoover Institution, which is smack in the middle of the Stanford campus. The idea that Elon begins this by laying off half the workforce at Twitter, big layoffs taking place at Facebook and elsewhere around Silicon Valley. The kids, these brilliant young CS students here at Stanford, who for a decade and more have been able to simply waltz into the workplace, demand working conditions to their liking and very high salaries. Suddenly that has changed. And for the big players, the Tim Cooks of the world, supply chains that run through China are all of a sudden really difficult, really problematic. How do we, so you've got kind of the long arc of disruption, but also these short-term shocks to the way things work out here in the Valley.
No, fascinating. Well, I want to come back to the supply chain point in particular, but Simon, that point about capital, of course, that's slightly jarred. That's a startup fact. This report actually shows something slightly different for the survey participants, doesn't it? Actually, most of them, I think some 95%, say we do have the resources to invest. That's not a problem. We have the capital. Maybe that's a reflection of the difference between the startup world now and larger corporates. But actually, we sometimes, and quite large numbers, 83%, said that often their boards impede progress by asking, questions, getting in the way, slowing things down. Could you just talk a bit about that?
I think there's a couple of things going on, Will. I think the survey did indeed demonstrate that in the top 10 concerns that CEOs have, availability of capital doesn't rank. That isn't to say they don't have to be focused on that. And of course, to the extent that it's financed by debt, it's significantly more expensive than it was. But what it does speak to is the fact it's not one of the most urgent problems. And what really screams out of this report, and certainly bears out our practical experience at AlixPartners working with our clients, is that the most important thing today for leaders and management teams is that they remain agile, that they don't become a hostage to a previous strategy that is no longer working. And their ability to pivot quickly and adapt quickly to change circumstances is what marks out the best leaders and the best management teams. And to your point, if the boards are struggling to keep up with the speed of those pivots, it can be incredibly frustrating for business leaders and management teams. But I think that the gears of governance sometimes don't work quickly enough to move with the agility that their management teams have to.
And look, some of this is quite gloomy, by the way. So let me give you another stat from the report. That 82% are expecting a recession or economic downturn to last more than a year. And obviously inflation looms large in that. A lot of them, nearly a majority, talk about having been severely impacted by inflation and knock-on interest rate activity. Gillian, I want to come to you here because you famously began to warn about the financial crisis in the run-up to 2008 in a way that was brilliant for Financial Times readers. What is your view yourself, but also from the business leaders you're talking about this expectation around recession, the impact of inflation and interest rates? Are they right to be this gloomy and this expecting of a recession?
Well, there's two questions there. If you're asking, is there going to be another financial crisis that people should worry about? My view is that yes, there are pockets of potential instability and dislocation around, say, the structure of the US Treasuries market, around the fact that a lot of investors have spent the last decade basically very complacently assuming that low interest rates will be here forever, and have failed to position themselves for higher rates, as we saw in the UK LDI pension crisis or shock. And there's other pockets of potential instability around things like dollar swaps or parts of the commodities world. So there's those pockets of financial instability, which I don't think are necessarily really systemic yet, but need to be watched. In many ways, what concerns me more is less the potential for a financial crisis than a political crisis or series of rolling political crises. Because the one thing that's very clear is that as we come out of the COVID era, as we face, a war, there's going to have to be a lot of sharing of pain, whether it's around things like higher energy costs or general problems around growth and high inflation. Some societies are very well equipped to share pain. Japan is a classic case in point, where they have all kinds of well-developed cultural mechanisms to spread pain out across society and essentially absorb blows without creating dramatic upheavals. I'm not convinced that, all of the Western European countries or America are well equipped to share pain. I mean, yes, the UK has a kind of rationing mentality in its folk memory, but, how are people going to react if things get very nasty over the winter and beyond, or in continental Europe? So I think that's also playing into the whole dimension as we look forward, because, yes, it's very likely that Europe will have a recession, given the current statistics, and that's been priced into the markets through things like the inversion of the yield curve. Yes, the US may have a shallow recession, although it seems less likely to be too painful, notwithstanding the fact that you've got an inverted yield curve as well developing. But the real question in my mind is not simply the magnitude of the recessionary downturn or stagflation. It's really about how that pain is or is not shared across society and what that means for political stability.
Peter, I want to bring you in here on both those things. So are the CEOs right to be pessimistic about economic fortunes going forward? And secondly, on that point from Gillian about sharing the pain and the political and geopolitical consequences of that, can you comment on that, please?
Are the CEOs right to be pessimistic? Probably, I would imagine. I am more and more struck. I've been here in Silicon Valley for a long time now. This came to mind when you read about the executives who are concerned that their boards meddle. I'm more and more struck all the time, although we've forgotten it, or we seldom talk about it anymore. Some version of Moore's Law, not exactly Moore's Law anymore, but some version of Moore's Law is still taking place in the background all the time. Computing power is becoming cheaper, more widely dispersed. If there's a technical or computational problem that can't be solved today, wait 6 months. And this, of course, means that all kinds of settled ways of doing things are bound to be disrupted sooner or later. If disruption is simply defined as, will you be able to do business the same way tomorrow that you did business yesterday? The answer is, in all kinds of ways, unlikely. You probably won't. But beyond that, the point about boards meddling seems to me, I'm more and more struck, as I say, about the speed with which startups can start, test their product, get an answer, fail, or get bigger. And the inability of corporations, if the old question was, if we have electric vehicles coming, who's going to be better at it? Companies that are fresh to the marketplace, or a BMW that's been producing cars for a century? In other words, a big corporation, is it going to be able to develop change within its own structures? Or do you put your money on a startup? And I'm just struck again and again by the way the startups are freer to raise capital, make experiments, and fail, if necessary. Most of them, of course, do fail. Elon Musk has not failed at Tesla. So this startup culture, they're tight on money. The kids are shocked that they won't be able to get jobs the way they used to. But this is the first time they've been through a downturn in the economic cycle. The fundamental point that out here in Silicon Valley, now also in Austin, of course, with regard to biology in the Boston Route 128, the notion of startups being able to draw upon young talent and increased computer power to take tests, to try stuff. If you're a big corporation, it's just going to be trouble. Sooner or later, it's going to be trouble.
Could I jump in on this, Will? It's so interesting, this point, Peter, because I mean, clearly what Elon Musk has demonstrated in spades is the first mover advantage into electric vehicles. I mean, an extraordinary first mover advantage. But what we're now seeing, of course, is that that first mover advantage has expired. And the auto manufacturers that have been making vehicles, albeit internal combustion engine vehicles, for 100 years, are now catching up in terms of their development, and they have the means to scale. So did the startup give a first mover advantage? Absolutely, but that first mover advantage does expire. On the other point that Gillian, you referenced about anxiety, what's so interesting in this year's survey is that the anxiety that's profoundly obvious for chief executives, funnily enough, isn't obvious for executives 1 or 2 levels down from the CEO, that actually there's a lot of optimism in the level 2 and level 3 executives because they see at least as much possibility in the disruptions that are happening to their business in their industry as they do challenge. And of course, the poor CEOs who aspire to be on a throne found themselves in a hot seat and are now fearing that in fact it's an ejector seat, and will they be able to survive this period of disruption is real. But actually underlying it, Will, is quite a lot of optimism.
Can I just jump in here and say, guess what? Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And nobody who is a CEO who's middle-aged is going to say, we love the idea that all of this new tech is going to create a really scary, weird, disrupted world that our younger generation and colleagues can understand, but I can't understand, and which could potentially challenge my job. And I was very struck because I was moderating a large collection of CEOs a few months ago talking about working from home. And they were, to a person, complaining about the fact that their younger colleagues didn't want to come into the office as much as they thought they should. And halfway through, some of the younger colleagues said, well, actually, we do that partly because we don't see why we need to be in the office, because, you like these big corner rooms because you can physically dominate work. We don't feel that we actually want that. And the CEO said, well, we need to see you all to manage you. We can't manage you unless we can see you in the office. To which the millennials said, well, that's because your management skills are wrong. You don't understand how to manage people digitally, and that's what we're used to. So it's absolutely no surprise to me that the older generation is feeling threatened and isn't feeling wildly enthusiastic, because guess what? C-suite turkeys do not vote for Christmas.
That's a great point. I mean, it may explain, by the way, one thing that really I stood out to me is that 85% of the folk that AlixPartners surveyed said they just find it difficult to know where to start. I mean, it's if ever that was a cry for help.
Well, can I say one other thing, which I actually thought explains a lot of what's going on today? It's a topic I'm very passionate about, which is this perception of what the role of the individual is versus society, which is that, most societies in most parts of the world, in most of history, anthropologists know, view the individual as a derivative of society, and you, the individual, has to fit into the society. In Western Europe, starting with the Enlightenment, the idea began to spread that actually society was a derivative of individuals, and essentially the individual was at the center of their world. And that gave birth to ideas like human rights and stuff, or the me generation in the late 20th century. What this device technology has done is take that idea even further and create the impression or illusion that individuals can remake the world around them, customize it according to their desires using digital technology. So you can customize your coffee choices, your media sources, your music. I mean, everyone has playlists today. They don't have vinyl records or just put up with just switching on the radio according to someone else's schedule. You customize your political choices. People want issues, not parties, et cetera, et cetera. And that's extending itself into the workplace too, because a unifying feature of younger people today thinking about work is that they want to choose when they come into work. We'll come in 3 days a week, but they hate the idea of not having choice about when they come into work. And a generation that's grown up in generation playlist, generation pick a mix, regards this as a God-given right and natural. And COVID has massively exacerbated that. A generation of crumblies like me, who grew up in a generation of cassette tapes and vinyl records and having no choice about your food at school, you just got given your school dinner, you couldn't go to a canteen and mix and match to your heart's content. It's quite an alienating concept. And I think that again explains this clash between the generations, that the older generation are used to being given what they have to accept, and the younger generation live in generation pick a mix generation playlist.
That's fascinating, Peter. I've got to ask you this. Maggie Thatcher was right then. There is no such thing as society. In fact, more than that, there's no such thing as a society even within the workplace.
Maggie Thatcher was right about everything, Will. That's simple. By the way, could I trot something out? A question. I'd really like to hear what the other three of you have to say about it. I'm going to stumble a little bit as I formulate this, because it's just occurred to me since I was in Israel last week. Israel has always been surrounded by bigger neighbors. It has always had to rely for the defense of the country on innovation. All right. The United States, our way of, frankly, the American way of war has, at least since the Civil War, relied on overwhelming materiel. Grant simply grinds down Lee. During the Second World War, we produced thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of airplanes and ships and so forth. But now we in the United States find ourselves in a strategic box similar to that of Israel. We can't outspend or outproduce China. Innovation is going to become far more important to our way of defending ourselves, to use Eisenhower's famous phrase, the entire military industrial complex. Point one. Point two, I'll make it just briefly. Innovation has moved outside the Pentagon. The Pentagon is used to, during the Cold War, was characterized by very tight relationships between the generals who did the procurement and big aerospace companies. Innovation now takes place in the tech sector. It takes place in startups. And the Pentagon isn't very good at handling innovation, and now faces the problem that it's going to have to reach out to bring innovation in. Somehow or other, it seems to me that this entire space of whatever passes for the military industrial complex, that's an old-fashioned term, for goodness sake. There has to be some new term. But this is now going to be an enormous piece of the American economy that's going to be suffer or enjoy, depending on your point of view, one disruption after another. Bibi Netanyahu, when I spoke to him last Sunday, I said something about capturing innovation from the private sector and putting it to use in the military. And he said, no. Here in Israel, we do it just the other way around. It's in the military that a number of our leading entrepreneurs get their initial training and see the problems that need to be solved. And then they go out to the private sector. There just seems to me that this entire vast sum of money that we spend each and every year on defense, that of course produces an enormous industry, all of this is going to be changed, and changed pretty quickly. There's the next big space for disruption. Now, am I slow? Am I wrong? I'd love to hear what you think about that, if I may.
Can I jump in here and say that, because I've done a lot of work looking at this in relation to Ukraine, and it's worth saying that for Ukraine, Israel is the model right now. And Ukraine is a case study in shifting patterns of innovation, in that there's a real difference in how Ukrainian society and Russian society is organized. Russian society operates with the people at the bottom having no sense of agency in a very vertical hierarchical system, and information goes up, orders come down, and traditionally innovation occurred through top-down orders. Ukrainian society, and I did my PhD in the Soviet Union, so I've been watching this very closely and immersed in this for a long time. Ukrainian society has increasingly developed a lateral model of self-organization, whereby essentially people feel very empowered. There's a strong sense of agency in the square. And when you combine that with the fact that the tech sector in Ukraine has exploded since 1991, because a very large part of the Western world's companies outsource their IT operations to Ukraine, And the Ukrainian computer engineers stayed in Ukraine for the most part because of tax incentives. They went into the war with this massive pool of several 100,000 techies who were essentially embedded in global networks of technology and computer science. And I know a lot of these guys very well. And what they've done is they've set up both underground railroads with tech companies in Silicon Valley, which are channeling not just material, but ideas into Ukraine. But they've also, inside the Ukrainian military, created structures whereby each battalion has its own CTO that's doing rapid, iterative, experimental innovation and testing of products and ideas in competition with other battalions using open source platforms like GitHub to swap ideas and very deliberately aping Silicon Valley's private sector model of beta testing, UX research, et cetera, to surface ideas. And I've written a lot about how they've used this in relation to drones, Starlinks. They're now using it for generators. I had a dinner at my house 3 days ago with a group of them. And they're racing against time all the time to do this experimental bottom-up innovation. Now, what's really fascinating to pick up on your point, Peter, and I think it's terribly relevant for any CEO or executive, is that this issue between vertical hierarchies and lateral self-organization is critical for any company in a digital era where the whole structure of communication and trust is changing rapidly. The question of how you absorb private sector ideas into the public sector and vice versa is critical in the world where we're seeing the rise of the wartime economy, and we're going back almost to the 1940s and 50s. It could potentially provide one way for Ukraine to innovate the hell out of its own economy when peace comes, and they're very consciously modeling themselves on Israel. But the other point, coming back to your point, Peter, is the Pentagon tells me upfront they are learning from Ukraine, not the other way around for the most part right now. And every small country out there, whether it's Estonia or Taiwan, is looking at what's happening with Ukraine right now as a playbook for how you can use digital tech and innovation to wield asymmetric power.
Fascinating.
Can I jump in?
Please, Simon, I'm going to bring you in, please.
I think Peter asked such a great question, and I love the example, Gillian, you've led us through with Ukraine. And of course, the urgency and immediacy, let alone the human tragedy of what's going on, is creating this environment for innovation, which, as we observe it, is just extraordinarily powerful. But I think what's also happening is there's some longer term changes that are happening that aren't as visible, but ultimately will be extremely profound, that also require us to innovate. So, for example, think about demographics. In the early 1990s, China had 10 working people for every one retired person. If you look today in China, there's only 4 working people for every one retired person. If you look forward 20 years based on current trends, there'll only be 2 workers for every retired person. So the demographic shift over a multi-decade period is fundamentally changing the economics of major economies. And so back to your question, Peter, the only way that economies are going to be able to deal with the economic challenge of that is through innovation. So innovation, I think, is just as critical for the long seismic changes as it is for the immediate urgent changes.
And innovation makes the future gloriously unknowable, because no one would have predicted that Ukraine would have resisted Russia so long. And the Ukrainian government, and I was in Ukraine quite recently, is absolutely upfront about the fact that was it not for the presence of these lateral innovative networks, they would have crumbled a long time ago. So when you look forward as a company 20 or 30 years and say what's going to happen, it's not clear, because innovation is a great, gloriously unknowable factor.
But given that, then, and given the clear success from that kind of business model, given that CEOs in this report, almost to a woman and a man, say that they recognize they're going to have to change their business models in the next year, 2-3 years, which is quite a substantial undertaking. What's stopping fundamentally CEOs going faster? because there is a clear need. There are some emerging models around innovation, the success of it. What's holding them back, and what advice would we give them in order to be able to go faster with the clear change that they need to make and the embracing of innovation and new ways of working?
Maybe I could jump in, Will. I mean, what our research absolutely underlines is our practical experience of working in these significant and often urgent situations, which is a leader and the leadership team doing something nearly right, but doing it now has a complete premium over trying to wait for perfection. A good strategy implemented with urgency and vigor will always outperform a perfect strategy implemented poorly. So there's a premium on agility, there's a premium on action, and of course governance systems in larger corporations are rarely set up for this. Your point earlier about boards of directors trying to keep up. But the very best leaders, which of course is a leading indicator on the very best corporates that we've analyzed, are characterized by their propensity to move to action, doing it nearly right, but doing it now.
I think that's a really important point. 6.5 out of 10 now rather than 9 out of 10 when it's too late is the right way to think about it. But let's take AI, right? It must be the same for you guys. Every business meeting I go to now, everyone is angsting about AI. My son is using AI to do his essays. I probably shouldn't say that, but he seems to get good marks. It's becoming incredibly disruptive, but clearly the main theme you get from business leaders, I really don't know where to start. Do I go all in now, or do I wait until it becomes there's a clearer path to how it can actually positively impact my business model? Let's dive into that. How should they be thinking about that? Peter, should they be taking stakes in a range of different startups in this space? Should they be hiring in a big name AI expert? What are some of the practical things that we can equip business leaders with on this call about how to embrace that kind of clear disruptive technology?
My own bias is, yes, take stakes in startups, even small stakes. My observation, this is all very modestly put because I'm in the middle of a think tank. I don't run a corporation. I haven't been active in the business world 100% of my time for a long, long time now. But what I have noticed is that even a small bet in a startup out here in Silicon Valley gives a corporation share of mind among the entrepreneurs. And by the way, if you're running a corporation of some standing, entrepreneurs, the kids who run these startups tend to be in awe in some way. On the one hand, they'll diss big corporations, but at the same time, they're in awe of operations that have standing and that can get big things done. So you'll even with an inexpensive and small investment, you'll achieve the right to call the entrepreneurs, ask questions, to receive an education. I have seen again and again really intelligent corporations make small investments across startups here in Silicon Valley as a way of achieving an education for themselves. Think of it as knowledge transfer, less perhaps than an investment. That I have seen that work in an impressive way. So I suppose, yes, that would sort of be my first. Place cheap bets and think of it as a way of getting information.
And Simon, what else should they do? What are some of the used, effective tools for CEOs to take on this challenge? Clearly, they get it, but clearly they also feel that the current teams they've got, the skill sets, the culture isn't delivering the rapid change and improvements that they need. So what else should they be thinking about?
Well, as Gillian, I think, pointed out earlier, generationally, business leaders, CEOs, were not born in a digital era. So even if they've got the mindset for these issues, they almost certainly haven't got the skill set for these issues. So, of course, that puts at a premium having the skill set in the leadership team to be able to understand what the right questions are to ask, let alone how to get to the answers. And so critically, what leaders have to do is to make sure they understand what this means for them. And of course, in the sphere of digital generally and AI specifically, they may have the data, but they may not have the access to the tools to understand what the data is telling them about where their customers are going, where their supply chains are going. So they're data rich, but insight poor. So they have to get the means and the insights. To Peter's point, I think taking small stakes in startups is one way to get it, making sure that even in what's been a tight labor market and an even tighter skills market, that actually there are people who are digitally facile, understand what the challenges are for that business in that industry, and can be asking the right questions. So critical to have that thinking in the leadership team.
Gillian, is it on that basis, is it doable, or is there a case that the speed of change, the array of different incomings, we haven't even talked about, environmental challenges, the climate change, the deglobalization, supply chain. There's a raft of different incomings to CEOs, the likes of which, we've been in journalism the same period of time. I can't remember a more challenging time to be a business leader. Is it actually doable? Is there a way out of this, or is there a different way of thinking about this that CEOs should embrace?
Well, the answer is I think it's absolutely doable. AI is having some remarkable implications and consequences. I went onto Twitter yesterday and discovered someone had used an AI tool to write a rap song about me, which was actually quite a good rap song as it happens. But I think there are, 2 or 3 things to do. Firstly, everything that Peter has said about taking stakes in startups, and what Simon said about trying to reimagine how you work and where you get advice, that's all very, very sensible. The 2 other points I'd add to that, though, are firstly, to stop thinking of it as artificial intelligence, but start thinking of it as augmented intelligence. Because the whole point about AI tools is that they only actually have power if you use them in conjunction with human beings, which leads me on to my other point, which is the most powerful way to use it is to combine artificial intelligence with what I call anthropology intelligence, a study of humans and how they react to computers and AI tools, and put them together to create this augmented intelligence. And you need to do that because there are limits to AI. AI essentially takes an incredibly comprehensive snapshot from gathering up data of the world as it existed, 2 seconds before, and projects it to the future. One problem with that is it tends to create data about noise, not silence. And silence is a lot of what matters in culture and shapes how culture operates. Secondly, you can't always presume that what's happened in the past is going to be exactly the same as the future. You get disruptive elements coming in. And the thing about AI is that it doesn't necessarily capture the complexity of human culture. To give you an example, there's one thing that no AI platform has ever done yet successfully, never mind the fact it can sort of scan financial markets and, solve diseases and, play Go and all that kind of stuff. No AI computer has ever told a really good joke. They've tried repeatedly, but there's no AI computer that's ever managed to be really funny. And the reason is that human beings are essentially defined by tribal patterns that play into jokes. You have to be in a social tribe to get a joke. If you're not, you don't get it. And those boundaries are very hard to define. And jokes operate by essentially playing on the silences in our culture, what we don't talk about, which is tough for a big data platform to pick up because they're trained to pick up noise, data. And jokes play off the contradictions in our world because our world doesn't make sense in our heads. And AI is designed to essentially act as if we are consistent, rational beings. So for all those reasons, I think that AI is powerful, but needs to be used with caution and with relation to the human aspect as well.
I think it's fascinating. I just need to ask you, how do we find the rap song about you?
Yes, exactly.
If you go onto Twitter and just type in, under my handle at Gillian Tett, whatever, you'll find it. It came as a huge surprise to me. It was like someone literally popped up yesterday and said, I've used AI to write a rap song about Gillian. It's like, oh my God.
Right. That is, I'm not sure if that's peak disruption or what, Gillian, but I'm going to go.
What rhymes with anthropologist?
I think it was more anthrovision.
Got it.
Worth noting, and Peter, I'm detecting you may want to ask another question, which I'm going to see to you in 1 second. Just worth noting that 56% of respondents said that advancements in technology are happening at a rate that their companies cannot keep up with. So it really is quite stark, the message that's coming through here about how fast these incoming changes are happening and CEOs struggling to get there. Peter, do you want to come in?
Yes, could I ask another question that I just love to hear everyone address? And here's the way it goes. I interviewed Rob Portman, who's outgoing senator from Ohio, about a month ago. And one of the topics we discussed was the collapse of journalism in Washington. I don't mean to denigrate anybody, including Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, but Rob said that in the course of his career, and he started out in the House of Representatives 3 decades ago, there's just less and less serious reporting. So how do you handle that? Well, Rob handled it by making much more of his own press operation, by being much more intentional about telling his own story. Okay. And I think, and it turned out that was a useful discipline. What are we attempting to do? What story are we trying to tell? And then I think to myself, Alex Karp always took telling the Palantir story, and continues to take telling the Palantir story very seriously. He, from the get-go, has effectively been his own business reporter. So I'm just wondering if this is the dream of somebody who's effectively a journalist and doesn't know enough about business, but it just seems to me that taking communication seriously and thinking of it as much more than simply how do we handle the next earnings call could prove a really useful discipline for C-suites to adjust, to test new ideas, new thoughts, and so forth. Or am I saying something childish there? I'm just wondering. I really would love to hear you address that.
I would love to pick that up, Peter, because from my own experience and at AlixPartners, some of the most, I would even say many of the most successful business leaders have sort of adopted the persona of being their own chief communication officers, because they can tell the arc of a story, the vision of the business, what they're trying to build, why it's purposeful, so important, of course, for employees as well as customers, what they anticipate are going to be the bumps in the road on the way there. Their ability to narrate that story, to be their own chief communication officer, is often a hallmark of their remarkable leadership. So in a world, as Gillian referenced earlier, where so many of our, the way we get news is curated in echo chambers that we create, often reinforcing our own attitudes and at times prejudices, I think it makes it even more necessary for leaders generally, but in my world, business leaders, to be their own chief communication officers.
Gillian, you and I started at the Financial Times, I think, in the same week, in the, I think I'm going to say the early 90s. What's your view?
Well, one view is I think you had a rather more successful trajectory than me, Will. But the bigger issue is that, yes, business leaders need to be communication officers. Yes, they need to tell stories. Yes, they need to actually engage with journalists rather than running away from them. But they also, at the same time, need to be amateur anthropologists. And by that, I mean, people think anthropology is about doing a kind of academic version of Indiana Jones and going to wacky parts of the world, like the Amazon jungle, and having exciting adventures. It's not. It's about trying to understand the cultural patterns that shape us through a 3-part journey, which is part 1, you immerse yourself periodically in the lives and minds of people who think differently from you. And that can be in the Amazon jungle, or it can be just down the end of the road, a different political party. And the virtue of doing that is not just to understand difference, which is crucial in the modern world, but also because the single best way to understand yourself is to step out of your world and look back at yourself with someone else's eyes. The Chinese have this great proverb that a fish can't see water. None of us can see the assumptions that blind us unless we jump out of our fish bowls and go talk to other fish. And when you do that, when you have that insider-outsider with a perspective, you can then see both the noise in your life and the silence, the stuff you don't talk about, which is critical. And the reason that matters for chief executives telling their stories is because most of the sectors that have gone badly wrong in recent years, be that Wall Street before 2008, be that the tech sector before the tech clash, most of those sectors shared a common feature, which is the business leaders were so closeted in their own little citadel known as the C-suite office, and then rocketed up their hierarchy so fast and seemed so successful that they'd completely lost perspective of how the outside world saw them and the things that they were doing, which in retrospect looked really, really stupid. Silos make bright people really stupid. So if CEOs are going to tell their stories effectively in the wider world, they have to jump out of their fish bowls, talk to other fish, look back at how other people see them and how the water around them, the assumption, shapes them, and then actually have a proper story to tell, because otherwise they're in danger of looking totally smug and not listening, just talking.
Well, fascinating. Now, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. We are coming to final questions. So we've covered the main elements, which has been great. We've also provided some significant practical takeaways and advice for people watching, which is also great. I want to ask each of you to address this on a go forward basis, though. And I did detect slightly, maybe it's inaccurate, but that actually there are some signs that some of the disruptive factors maybe have peaked or will peak in the year ahead. So, for example, 44% said that supply chain issues are going to become less of a challenge in the next 12 months, for example. In a world in which it's possible that there's a settlement with the Ukraine and Russia, that COVID gets under control in all parts of the world, including China, that the supply chain issues settle down. Are we at peak disruption now? And when we ideally, if we are re-invited, if we reconvene in a year's time, will CEOs still be in this high state of anxiety, or will they be calmer? Will they have had a chance to address these issues? And will they be excited about embracing the innovation opportunities?
I'll jump in quickly and say, I think some of the short-term disruption issues that are creating fear amongst CEOs may down, most notably the supply chain issue. Inflation may well come down. Some of the labor market mismatch may well change. What I don't think is going to change, though, is the fact that this era of so-called great moderation, which dominated the careers of most of the people who now run companies, i.e. from the late 1980s to 2008, that worldview, which assumed that history went in one direction and globalization, free market capitalism, democracy could only strengthen and deepen, that perception has been really quite fundamentally shaken. And I don't see it being revived anytime soon, because the reality is, as we know in relationships, trust once shattered is very hard to restore. And trust amongst CEOs that the future is predictable and goes in a straight line, I don't think will be restored within their lifetime.
Peter, can you come in there, and then I'll come to Simon for the final word.
Sure. The tech is going to go on getting smarter. The supply of really bright kids, and it's important to stress kids, they don't know what they can't do, so they're willing to try almost anything. The supply of really smart kids is not going to dry up, so that the startup culture may change in one way or another as a result of this shortage of money as it feels to us out here in the Valley, as a result of the dispersion of Silicon Valley to Austin, Miami, and so forth. That may change. But the fundamental notion that bright kids will have more and more computing power to try stuff, that is simply not going to change. And that will cause one disruption after another. My own view is that I don't want to put words in Gillian's mouth, of course, but it seems to me the notion of the end of history, if I'm saying something like what Gillian said, that we've reached the end of history, that's absurd. China's not going away. It represents a fundamental challenge to the way we lead our lives, including our business lives. And that facing up to that challenge will, I think, cause us to have to re-examine all kinds of things, including what we touched on briefly, the huge part of our economy that's devoted in one way or another to national defense. That's going to lead to new ways of thinking and doing business and to disruption. So it ain't over. This disruption, the need for agility, the need in some ways to worry about what you can't see. Who's working on a startup at this very moment that may come after the way we do business? That's a permanent fact of modern business life, I think.
Yeah, my own reflection would be that there's no going back to normal.
Yes.
This isn't a period that we're going to get through and then go back to normal. That's just not going to happen. To riff on Peter's point, new disruptions will emerge and they'll carry on accelerating. But I actually see more opportunity in disruption than I see threat. I see opportunity because of the creativity that comes out of innovation. The fact that actually the marginal cost of storing data now is almost zero. The ability through better data analytics, new innovative technologies and insights to create value in new and different ways will be why we can cope with these fundamental shift in demographics, how we will rise to the challenge of the energy transition, how we will rise to the profound challenge of the environment. So I see more opportunity than challenge, but there's no going back to normal.
Great. Well, look, it's been a really wide-ranging, fascinating conversation. Thank you all very much indeed. And I know we're all, Gillian, I hate to say it, we're all going to go away now, obviously, and listen to your rap about you. So
Please don't.
Other than that, thank you very much for joining in, everyone.
Thank you very much.
A pleasure, Will. Simon, Gillian, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Simon Freakley in London, Gillian Tett in New York, Peter Robinson in San Francisco. Thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.